Okay, then, so here we go. This is the presentation for Marta Savigliano's Tango and the Political Economy of Passion. These slides that I'm gonna be showing you do not have that much information, meaning I tried already to condense most of the information in little bullets so that I don't have heavily charged slides for you. I only have one slide with a bunch of text, and only because it's the summary of all of the contents of the book. But after that, I will mostly be trying to have this presentation in a sort of more dialogical or conversational style so that it doesn't get too heavy, right? So first we're gonna go through a summary, then we will discuss briefly some of the historical and geographical itineraries that tango traced as it became sophisticated and as it was systematized in Europe and France and England. And we're gonna finish off with final migration of tango in Japan. And then after that, we're gonna show a mental map that includes sort of the most important, the key aspects, the key conceptual aspects of the book in itself. So bear with me as we go through the very first slide. And this, as I announced a second ago, this is going to be the summary of all of the most crucial elements that we're going to be reviewing today, right? So here we go. This is a bifurcated account of tango, relying on a theatrical account of tango's vernacular characters, their laments and their plots, intertwined with chronological and historical descriptions of its appearance and popularization since the 19th century. Ruffians, prostitutes, and petite bourgeoisie are dancing with one another under the embrace of international recompositions of economic domination and colonial hegemony over Argentina. Brothels, academies, and cabarets were the locus for the emergence not only of tango, but of class mobility, homo-affective sociability, and public demonstrations of personal misery. Lewd and resentful decries for the upward mobilities of milonguitas and their treason were the main trope in tango lyrics, animating both a misogynistic spectacle and a cultural practice of fleshy pleasures. Savigliano's genius resides in reading tango through a postmodern lens and conversely reading postmodernism through tango. By becoming herself a double sided mirror, she forces for the harmful components of postmodernism and tango to act on one another instead of on her, in one big intellectual clash where patriarchy's violence confronts Western imperialism. So sorry for that slide. I know it was a little bit heavy, but I promise it's gonna make a lot more sense as we unpack individually the different concepts and the different elements of it. That was sort of an introduction so that we could have a picture of what it's coming at you, right? So now let's move on a little bit when it comes to the historical and geographical itinerary of tango. So as you know, tango originated in Argentina and Uruguay in the very tail end of the 19th century, so 1880, and it started doing its first round of migration in 1912, traveling all the way to Paris, to London, and New York City. After that, and once that it became westernized and sanitized and desexualized to a certain degree, it was finally adopted in Japan too. So this final round of migration, at least the one that we're going to be considering here for the sake of this book, of the scope of this book, has to do with another layer of exotification between marginal people or people from the peripheries, especially if we consider that tango in itself is a creation of lower class, lower income, poor communities of racialized individuals that were economic migrants arriving in the city of Buenos Aires. and then in 1940 we have finally this sort of return, right? This full circle moment after tango already migrated to London, to Paris, to New York City, to Japan. It returns to Buenos Aires in this sort of regurgitation, this cultural regurgitation that actually changes the status of the practice of tango inside of Argentina. After it did that whole migratory circle, it returns under a different rubric, and the technique in itself has changed, and it socially and culturally has gained a different sort of reputation and social status, right? Moving right along, now it's the moment for me to discuss the actual map, this mental map that I have prepared for you. We are gonna be treating this mental map of this diagram as if it was the kind of map that you can find on the subway of any cosmopolitan or metropolitan city, right? Any urban city. So we're gonna be trying to understand that each and every one of these categories are sort of located in these different hubs that you can see on the slide that I'm projecting now, but mostly we're gonna be reading these from left to right. So here we go. If at any given point there are some questions or some concerns about the relationship between these different components or the progression of this narrative that we're trying to put together for you, please raise your hand or let us know if there are any questions or any comments about it, right? So, okay, starting from the very left, let's just tackle the issue head on. Here we are talking about tango. What is tango? Tango is a cultural practice that originated in the porteño city of Buenos Aires by the end of the 19th century, in the turn of the century between the 19th century and the 20th century. Mostly it is ascribed to racialized, to marginalized people, especially economic migrants coming from Europe and also coming from the countryside of Argentina, the gauchos who were traveling and meeting with each other in this emergent, blossoming city of Buenos Aires that it's about to become a powerhouse in economic terms. It's really the hub for this harbor city for the economic development, right? This boom that Argentina is about to see in the beginning of the 20th century with the exportation of meat, and all these beef barons also bring along this concentration of new demographics and these alterations, this recomposition of demographics in Buenos Aires with all of these migratory waves meeting. So then the tango, usually it's floating around this, especially the lyrics are floating around this recurrent topic of the personal demonstration of, the public demonstration of the personal misery. So we're gonna discuss a little bit more and illustrate that once that we read a couple of the tangos that we have selected. But in general terms, there's always this sort of tragic and this dreadful situation of loneliness and misery and economic misery and a romantic failure that includes the decry of the male singer for the departure of the female partner who has decided to embark in this social mobility, upward social mobility journey, and in that journey leaving the compadrito or the male dancer and singer behind, the male tango dancer, right? What is distinctive of tango is that it's characterized by this close embrace of the bodies and this very intricate and fast footwork, right? That has been associated nowadays, at least for our contemporary sensibility, has been associated to sensuality and eroticism. But we're gonna problematize and kind of dig deeper into those two categories because they have changed across the different eras of tango. So that is one of the main narratives of the quote unquote origin of tango, And once that we turn the century from the end of the 19th century and jumping into the 20th century, we have this emergent preoccupation for the original tango. So some of the press releases and some of the pieces of media, of printed media that Marta Savigliano recovers in her book deal with this preoccupation for this lost origins of tango and this sort of degenerated version of tango that was happening at the beginning of the 20th century. What were the reasons for critics and cultural commentators to say that the tango was changing? Well, the whole argument was centered precisely around the issue of sensuality and sexualization of the practice, right? So the early critics at the beginning of the 20th century that were missing and that were reminiscing the original, the quote-unquote original tango, they were complaining that the tango has become all of a sudden sexualized in this sort of double entendre for finding a partner and for seducing a partner. And they were explaining that in the original tango, those were not actually important elements at all. And that the original tango dancers, there were actually male dancers who were dancing either with one another, which is something that has been seen in photographs and records of those times, but also mostly dancing for one another in the sense of tango at the core of the original tango was this intention of demonstrating skill and ability between male dancers. That could be, what it's important to say here is that this the respect that it's always expected between male dancers occurs and happens across races, classes, and statuses, right? So this is actually at the core of the criticism that Marta Savigliano is going to offer, because she's saying that implicitly she's framing this as a homo affective practice or a homosocial practice, in the sense that even though the male dancers were supposed to be sexually interested in females, at the same time the practice in itself is built in such a way that you dance tango to impress your male peers, regardless of the race, the gender, their status or their class. And so this respectability is almost this ground level operating for the tango male dancer, which is not something that it is definitely not something that we can appreciate when it comes to the female dancer, because it's quite the opposite. According to Savigliano, and after reviewing making a comparison of the different tangos and the lyrics of the tangos, you can really tell that disdain, this almost social curse that it's ingrained in a lot of the lyrics of tango, are always directed against the female body and never against the male body. So now it's a good moment to clarify that when Savigliano is describing these waves of migration coming from Germany, from Italy, from Spain, and arriving in the porteño city of Buenos Aires, as well as the gaucho people coming from the countryside, most of them, they were economic migrants looking to partake in the emerging, blossoming new economy of Buenos Aires, of the harbor city, exporting goods and commodities around the globe. But these were mostly males. These were mostly men. And so in a lot of the lyrics of tango, you can really see that there's a lot of decomposition, a lot of fractioning of the family unit, the traditional family unit, in the sense that these male tango dancers were competing for women. They were competing for the attention of women, both as romantic partners and as dance partners, right? And what Savigliano says is that even though male dancers across classes and races and statuses, they were competing for females, at the same time they only wanted the respect of other male partners. And that is why in the lyrics of the tango they keep saying an overarching and reiterating trope is this social curse of saying, "Oh, you have left me. You, my female partner, have left me for your interest in social mobility, and now you are surrounded by luxury, and you have left me by myself, and I am miserable now, and I'm all alone, and now you're enjoying this life filled with luxuries, and you're enjoying it, but you must remember that you are only gaining this new status because of your beauty, but your beauty is gonna finesse, and all of a sudden you're gonna end up alone, and this kind of social curse is identifying it is identifiable in many different tango lyrics. And this whole situation can be encapsulated in what Marta Savigliano says in a beautifully written sentence, but also with horrible implications. She's saying that women became the pawns for male dancers fighting against each other, right? So the female were the pawns that they were using to contradict one another. So their hatred and their social course was always directed to the female body, never against another male partner. She says that, Savigliano says that even when they are competing between males, they almost they could make fun of each other, or they could even jokingly comment on each other's capabilities and skills when it comes to dancing, but never really inflicting like this sort of violence that is reserved for the milonguita, for the tango female dancer. This is also sort of crystallized or illustrated in this reference that Marta Savigliano does of Jorge Luis Borges's work when he says that any man that spends more than 5 minutes thinking of a woman must be queer, right? So even though that might sound like an oxymoron for our contemporary sensibility, that encapsulates this other sort of sensibility, right? This sort of compulsive heterosexuality, yet at the same time, this highly homo-affective or homo-social relationality that tango was putting forth, right? A couple, two more notes on the issue of authenticity and the origin of tango is that Savigliano does warn the reader about the very question of being concerned with the original tango, quote unquote original tango, right? She's saying that that question in itself is very much a westernized or a western sort of preoccupation, right? And we will discuss a little bit later about this issue of Europeans being concerned with authenticity and their origins, right? But that is why Savigliano says that we need to be cautious of replicating that inadvertently, that sort of mentality, that Western epistemology in the search for origins, the origins of certain practices. Because Savigliano says that even if we go back to the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, and we look for the origins of tango, already we're gonna be confronted with the fact that there's not an essential Argentinianness, that there's already such a high degree of hybridization in racial and cultural terms because of all these waves of people of different origins arriving to the city that saw the tango emerging, right? And at the same time, she does said that Marta Savigliano says that it is the result of a colonial mindset to put because of the colonial domination or because of the colonial imposition and violence, we, the colonized peoples, we always end up with this need, this urge to identify ourselves and actually look for our authentic selves, right? So the colonized person is always left with this wound, this preoccupation to try to assert themselves or to assert their identity by finding it, and hence the look for original origins and authenticity, right? And then the final thing that I'm gonna mention about the search, the complexities of looking for the origin of tango, is that in a lot of the historical accounts that we can find of people that have done ethnomusicological studies or ethnochorological studies, they always reiterate this sort of narrative that puts black people and racialized people as always in this pre-modern and this sort of primordial and this sort of primitive stages of tango, and then reserving white people for as if they were the practitioners of the already sophisticated and the already evolved tango. So that is something to be cautious of. And while digging into the origin and the origin of the practice of tango, to not reiterate that narrative of black people as backward individuals that are only there for the prequel, for the origin of things, but then later move aside so that non-racialized people, white people, can sort of take it from there, right? So those are the two things that I wanted to mention. Now, let me just move into what I believe is the most interesting topic within the book. So we're going to be talking about the construction of the exoticism, the construction of exoticism and the exoticizing gaze. So when it comes to exoticism, the reason why I'm going to be talking about French exoticism as is because I need to sort of establish this ground level to show that the political economy of passion, as the title of the book hints at, was already established before the arrival and popularization of tango. That means that there was already a network in place for the exotification of cultural practices and their future commodification. So I'm going to be talking about French exoticism as the device and the kind of ideology that sustains this network of exchange and commodification of cultural practices, right? So for that, let's just go back for a second again to the 18th, 19th century and locate ourselves even in imagination in the European countries and the Western European countries when it comes to France, when it comes to Spain, when it comes to Germany. They were going through one of the most crucial transformations in recent modern history, which is the industrialization of their means of production, the modernization of culture, the urbanization of the cities, right? So these three quote unquote positive aspects they were coming along with this sort of existential anxiety, this existential dread and angst that was populating the air in during those years in Europe, right? Why? The reason is that, or the rationale behind it is that French people, German people are starting to think that things are happening too fast, as the train that they just inaugurated. All of a sudden, things are happening way too fast, and they are feeling lost. They are feeling that there's a certain disconnection from their origins. There we go back to that keyword, the origin and their authentic selves, right? So what was the industrialized, modernized, urban citizen now was being framed as this person disconnected from their roots, from nature, right? And so that is why Marta Savigliano says that it is precisely along these years that we can think of this notion, this idea of the European demise, right? This European demise that requires medicine, that requires a certain cure, right? And where are they going to be finding that cure, or at least where are they going to be looking for that cure? It's going to be in the countryside of these same countries, right? So this is relevant because this is how the exotification and exoticism was rehearsed before the arrival of tango, hence already lubricating and establishing this network of exotification and commodification, right? And so, yes, if Europeans are feeling like they are disconnected from their essence, from their root, they are, of course, thinking of the peasants and the people on the countryside as if they were the beholders of the torch of the German spirit or the French spirit, as if these people from the countryside, these peasants, these farmers, were actually holding the secret of the true French essence, right? And so what is very relevant to me, and it's also relevant for the case of this doctoral seminar, is to consider that, okay, there's a problem. What is the problem? The problem is this existential dread, this existential angst that it's in the air in the 18th and 19th century of the European countries in the transition from the Romantic era jumping into the modern era. And then there's a medicine, or at least there's a hope for a medicine that is to be found, right? That is to be searched on the countryside of these nations. But then what is interesting to me, and for the sake of the seminar, is to think of how they were approaching, or how they were going to find that medicine, what kind of method they were going to use to get there, right? And this we could equate this to a sort of research. They needed to find that medicine, right? And this coincides with the emergence of the notion of culture in itself, right? Culture as a conceptual category. So the notion of culture as a conceptual category, if we follow the paper that we read a couple of weeks ago from Williams, Marxism and Literature, was traced back to precisely the 18th and 19th century as a conceptual category that was needed to sort of differentiate between civilization and society, right? So at that point, civilization and society as concepts were not enough for approaching these peasants that were supposed to be holding the medicine for this modern European angst, right? Anxiety of losing their connection to nature, right? And so what I'm proposing here, and it's something that we can read between the lines, is not something that Savigliano herself is saying, is that the development, the search for that cure for this European angst require the new conceptual tool, the new conceptual category of culture as a way to assess and as a way to account for variation in cultures, right? For variation in ways of living, in ways of living, which is still today at the core of anthropology and cultural studies, right? Accounting for variation in ways of doing things, in ways of being. And this is at the core of this effort that was being put forth by the center of these nations, that are these urban centers of these nations, because they needed precisely a category with a little bit more of granularity, right? Because otherwise you will be left with insufficient categories. You will be saying, well, I'm talking about the people living in Paris and people in the center, the hegemonic center of power and taste. And if you don't have the concept of culture, you will be left with insufficient conclusions, saying, well, we are French and these people from the countryside, well, they are also French. So that is why, just to illustrate how the notion of the French civilization, the notion of civilization or society, as in French society, was all of a sudden not enough to be able to have that level of nuance or that level of granularity. That is why I'm saying here that in this transition between Romanticism and modernism, we have the cultural gaze, and the underbelly of it is this exoticizing gaze. So once that we account for the variation in ways of living, ways of being, we also open up the door to exoticizing these ways of being, right? And this is something that actually happened already with the flamenco and the can-can. So if we already have established that the creation, the emergence of the concept of culture and the network of exotification was already in place, I should also clarify that tango was by any means the first practice to be circulating within this network of exotification, right? On the contrary, there were two specific dances that were already rehearsing this exotification terrifying gaze. So when it comes to the flamenco, this Spanish dance that French critics will appreciate as this untethered and sort of unrestrained expression of passion and eroticism of the extroverted Spanish people. And then when it comes to the can-can, it was also this sort of expression of feminine sexuality, right? We've all seen the can-can dances of females kicking their legs way up high with these generous flowing skirts, right? On the stage of the Moulin Rouge and all of these cabarets that are so iconic of France. What is interesting there is that not only these practices, the can-can and the flamenco, are relevant for the study of tango because they were also exoticized in the same way that tango was, but they are also a couple of, these are two important case studies because they also allowed for the refiguration, the transformation of the role of the feminine dancer, right? So again, the transition between the romantic era into the modern era imply certain refigurations in the stereotypical figures of the females or female dancers, right? So we go from this sort of naive and shy and introverted and pure ingenue of the romantic era, and we, through practices such as the can-can, we get to experience this emerging new figure of the femme fatale, right? The femme fatale, which is by no means an ingenue, is quite on the contrary, a feminine figure, very much self-aware of her sexual prowess and not intimidated or not shy about using it or weaponizing it, right? She's actually self-aware of the kind of sexual attraction that she can pull from the audiences. And so once that these two practices have been already rehearsing the network of exotification, the political economy of passion, then we can talk about how tango makes its entrance precisely in this historical and cultural milieu, European milieu. What kind of milieu are we inhabiting? We already mentioned these issues of industrialization and urbanization and modernization of society, but there's also a very important and crucial aspect to the discussion of tango and why it was it arrived in a ripe moment, in the right moment for its popularization. I'm talking here of the feminist revolution, right? So if we locate ourselves in the 19th century, we already are having voting discussions surrounding voting rights and dress reform, as well as scientific developments around birth control. So because of these developments, right, tango almost enters into dialogue with the European society at a very good moment, at a very good historical and cultural moment, right? Savigliano does clarify that it's not that tango provoked all of these feminist transformations. It's not that because we have a femme fatale dancing in the tango, there we have the sexualized or unrestrained, sexually unrestrained feminine figure of the tango dancer. It's not that because of that we have all of these other aspects of the feminist revolution, but they dialogue quite well, right? That is kind of like the point that we wanted to highlight here. I will finish off this section by mentioning that once that the feminine figure is transformed from the ingenue to this sort of femme fatale, we also have very specific transformations of the practice in itself. So we jump from this high kicking feminine dancer, female dancer in the can-can, to the tango dancer who is all of a sudden constrained by a penciled skirt or this definitely tighter skirt that will interrupt or impede this sort of high kicks that were that were so distinctive of the can-can dancer, right? So that all of a sudden what the tango dancer has available is this sort of more intricate but downward sort of facing footwork, right? Another important transformation on the pragmatic level is that yes, the high kicks are gone, but also yeah, the costume has changed from this flowy big skirt to a tight skirt, and also we have the female femme fatale has to share the stage with a male fatale, right? The male fatale of tango. So whereas the can dancer was able to be by herself on the stage, displaying her skills and her body and the image of her body too, the tango dancer has to share the stage with a male dancer, a male dancer that is gonna frame her, reframe her, also embrace her tightly, and quite literally is gonna try to all the time access between her legs with his knee. And so these are sort of like the most pragmatic transformations when it comes to going from the romantic era, jumping into modernism, and also from the flamenco and can to tango. Then the two important migrations that follow that are the exportation of the tango in the US and Japan, and they are connected, of course. So before jumping into a couple of notes on the American reception of the tango, the US reception of tango, that is, and the Japanese reception of the tango, one last note on the adoption and the popularization of tango in Paris. Here we are talking about that when tango was intersecting the French society is within this whole cultural milieu that I was just characterizing right here of industrialization, urbanization of the cities and modernization. However, this did not happen without restrictions or without contradictions or without resistance, better said. Actually, it was the French lower class who resisted the adoption of or the incorporation of the tango, right? And unexpectedly, those who were also resisting or they were trying to contradict the adoption of of the tango in France were the upper classes in Argentina. So you might think for a second, how come that the lower classes of France don't want to adopt the tango, and the upper classes of Argentina don't want to for this practice to be adopted? Well, they had different opposing reasons, but the end goal was the same: to resist the adoption of the tango. So the lower classes in France, they will be precisely low income working class people, the proletariat, the people from the countryside, not the people living in the center, not people living in the center of Paris, but quite on the contrary, people that saw in the adoption of tango this sort of indirect threat against them, right? So it could have been read, this whole adoption of the tango, as if the center of the elite in Paris, the elite of power and taste, were threatening the people from the countryside by saying, if you don't want to cooperate with this, like if you are not participating in this unequal urbanization and unequal process of modernization of Europe, we'll just look around. There's so many uncivilized savages all around the globe, especially from the colonies or the freshly independent colonies that also have something to offer, something that we can exoticize too, right? So it isn't at this conjuncture that the people from the countryside felt that threat from the outside, right, from the colonies, as if they were replaceable, right, as if their role was not so irreplaceable anymore. But on the contrary, there was this hint that there are these always sort of savages or uncivilized, pre-modern people that could enter the political economy of passion too. And then on the opposite side of the Atlantic, we have the upper classes in Argentina who were resisting the adoption of the tango in France because they thought that it was a shameful practice that was misrepresenting them, right? So you have to consider that the original, quote unquote original tango was coming from this lower class, low income, poor economic migrants in this inhabiting this convoluted or even sometimes difficult personal relationships, and then that is why, maybe rightfully so, the practice in itself is being seen as this vulgar, non-dignified and non-honorable practice at all. And so the upper classes in Argentina were almost feeling treasoned. They were feeling the class treason by saying, how come that you guys in France are adopting this practice, this shameful, vulgar practice of the lower classes of my country? This does not speak of who we are as Argentinians. This does not speak of who we are as a nation, and it's such a pity that that it's being adopted by the bourgeoisie, the higher classes in France, right? So this was almost taken as an offense, as an offense and as a treason within upper classes, right? One last thing that I wanted to mention here is that this situation of the upper classes in Argentina resisting the adoption of the tango in France also almost reveals the importance of the progressive individuals, right? So what Savigliano is hinting at here is that, okay, if people from the lower classes in France are resisting this, people from the upper classes in Argentina are resisting this adoption of the tango too, then how did the tango get to France, right? And the answer lies in the hands of the progressive individuals within the upper classes of Argentina, right? So it's these progressive individuals who were traveling back and forth between France and Argentina, who were able to transmit the practice, right? To transmit the practice, and maybe even more importantly, who didn't identify themselves as hardcore Argentinians, right? So on the contrary, these progressive people, they were identifying with this emergent cosmopolite international class of higher class nomads, right? So in that way, they didn't feel the same shame, didn't take any offense by the tango being adopted by the French. If anything, it was just this quaint, exotic practice for them too, that could be something to be enjoyed anywhere in France or anywhere else. So just to give that nuance, that it's not like the entire upper class of Argentina was resisting it. It's the progressives within that class that facilitated the adoption of tango in France. We're finishing off here. I just have to speak about the adoption of Japan, of the tango in Japan, and then we're gonna finish off with a couple of concluding remarks. By the time that Japan is adopting the tango, we already have all of these waves of westernization and sanitation of the practice in itself, right? So regardless if it was the French style of the tango or the English style of the tango that were becoming popular, they both were sort of desexualizing the practice, right? There was not a lot of accent on the erotic or sensual aspects of the tango, but rather that was almost left exclusively for those who were practicing the original Argentinian tango, right? So the French style was seen as this variation of the tango that was a little bit more for the aristocracies. It was a little bit more dignified and less scandalous, right? And so desanitize, this desexualized tango is precisely the one that makes its entrance into Japan. And this works so in two ways. First of all, it is the incursion, the adoption of the tango in Japan was not only the result of bilateral interest or exchange between Argentinians and Japanese people, but as we were mentioning, it results from the intervention, the mediation of the Western gaze, right? But then, by the same token, the adoption of this desexualized version of the tango also allowed this westernized version of the tango also allowed for Japanese instructors, dance instructors and masters to protect themselves and their reputation, right? So because they were dancing the sanitized, desexualized, dignified version of the tango, they could in turn also claim to be doing something dignified and polished and sophisticated, as opposed to be doing the rowdy, untethered, savage, sensual tango that Argentinians will do, right? So this was a rhetoric way to also protect themselves from being considered too provocative, right? Because according to the Western map of exotification, Japanese people are these cold, introverted, reserved sort of people, and not very heated or not very passionate as the Argentinians are, right? Like they have a whole different way or reasons to be exotified, but not necessarily because of the passion, right? This is it, and then once that it was already adopted in all of these places, the tango returns to Argentina, although not to say that it wasn't returning throughout all of these years, but it definitely, we can definitely pay attention back to Argentina of after the Second World War, where already the tango returns under a different rubric, right? After the popularization of the tango in all of these places, it's almost gaining a certain stamp of approval from the aristocracies around the globe, or at least the bourgeois classes around the globe, who prove to be interested in this cultural practice, right? That afterward could be not only enjoyed by the proletariat or the lower classes of Argentina, but actually it becomes later the symbol of Argentinianness, right? And it becomes the cultural practice that it serves to assert the national identity of Argentina as a nation, right? Because Marta Savigliano is versed in dancing the tango and knowing the intricacies of it and the sort of disciplining of the body that it provides for feminine bodies more specifically, and she's also a scholar. She was a scholar trained in Hawaii and here in the US, well, in California too, I mean, and and because of that, she is versed and she has been trained in postmodern thought and postmodern framework, right? So when we're talking about the postmodernism, we can briefly, in a nutshell, say is this sort of ideology for late capitalism that it's almost the underbelly of post-structuralism, right? And so postmodernism usually is associated to the French post-structural authors such as Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault and Lyotard, right? And all of these folks claiming, among many different things, claiming this sort of resistance against meta-narratives, right? And this postmodernism being this sort of radicalization of relativism of a relativistic stance, charged with a nihilistic spirit. And Marta Savigliano knows very well of this because she was trained in it. One of the main methods of, or the main ideas of postmodernism is this notion of the textualization of the world, which is another idea that we have mentioned in the previous weeks. This notion of seeing everything as a text, even though I claim that it's been misunderstood in American academia, but that's a whole completely different thing. But at the core is that idea of everything as a text, the textualist turn, as well as the employment of this deconstruction method that that Derrida puts forth, right? Like as opposed to a genealogical method, that the constructive method tries to almost disassemble and recomposite histories and practices, right? And why am I mentioning all of this? Because Marta Savigliano, being trained again in both the corporeal practice of tango and the intellectual tradition of postmodernism, not to reify any sort of Cartesian dualism, but let's just put it that way for now. Because she's versed in these two worlds, she understands the harmful aspects of these two systems. On one side, she understands this, and she has unpacked already this misogynistic aspects of a tango culture. And on the other end, on the end of postmodernism, she's establishing, she's asserting quite firmly that postmodernism, instead of being a fracture of modernity, is actually a continuation of its efforts. And in that way, she claims that postmodernism is nothing but a continued colonialism, right? So having these two worlds with these very harmful features, what I visualize, what I understand that Savigliano is doing is almost removing herself from the picture and allowing for these two giants to clash against one another, right? Forcing for the misogynistic, sexualizing aspects of tango to be weaponized against this sort of nihilistic, cynical attitude of postmodernism, that mostly because she thinks that it's a necessary exercise, right? And not only to decolonize herself and her body, but also because they both adopt this cynical and fatalist attitude that more often than not is dwelling on this sort of nihilistic existential dread, as we were mentioning at the beginning of this presentation, right? This intellectual passion for the passionless. This in the side of tango is the desire of passion, and in the side of postmodernism is this desire for the passionless, for the silence, right? For these stages of silence between one burst of passion and the next one, right? So this dwelling on emptiness, on the silence, on the despair of both the lyrics of tango, as we were illustrating a second ago, and in postmodern scholarship, makes them a sort of good match of a couple, right? So that is what I believe Marta Savigliano is doing by the very end of this paper, confronting them too. And the reason, this is the reason why Marta Savigliano claims that she's not gonna be employing any method, or she's not gonna be using a methodology that is accurate or respectful of any sort of intellectual tradition that she's been trained on, because she says that if she were to respect the quote-unquote integrity of these bodies, these schools of thought, she will be advancing further her state of colonization, her state of being colonized. So instead, she's using this hybrid method of picking techniques and elements and concepts from different traditions, right, in order to fragment the unity of these schools of thought. And what I think it was a wonderful innovation is to consider that the tango in itself is not it's not only the subject of study, but becomes the methodology in itself to approach that subject of study, right? Something that has been put forward by people such as Traders Clark and all other authors invested in embodied research. But she's actually doing that, navigating these issues by the experience of dancing the tango herself, right? And getting to know that experiential substrate of doing so. And that's pretty much the end of this presentation. The whole book ends precisely on that, on completing the reading of the tango through a postmodern lens, and with a tango-based account on postmodernism. So reading postmodernism through the lens of tango as well. That is everything that I have prepared for you. So thank you so much for your kind attention. What we're gonna do next, it's kind of open up this Q&A session where we can discuss some of the main criticisms that we have prepared for you on a separate document. And we could also do a close reading of a passage of an expert that we selected from the book. After that, if there's enough time, we can connect the topic of the book with the research that David has done and the research that I'm doing as well when it comes to this issue of the political economy of passion. So thank you so much for your attention. If there are any further questions, I'll be happy to discuss them at large, and we can keep talking about this over email for sure. So thank you so much.